There are moments in television history that don't announce themselves as explosive. They begin quietly, almost politely, under studio lights designed to soothe rather than confront. These are the moments that later feel inevitable in hindsight, because they expose tensions that have been accumulating long before the cameras rolled. What unfolded on the Lorraine Show was one of those moments. Not because of shouting or spectacle alone, but because it revealed a deeper collision between narrative control and journalistic accountability, between personal grievance and public responsibility. This was not simply an uncomfortable interview. It was a study in contradiction, and the reason it resonated so widely is that it forced viewers to confront questions that had been hovering unresolved for years. Prince Harry entered the studio carrying more than his title or his reputation. He arrived carrying a carefully constructed public identity, one built through interviews, memoirs, documentaries, and speeches that consistently framed his life as a struggle against institutions, expectations, and inherited roles. For years, much of the media conversation around him has revolved around agency, his decision to leave royal duties, his right to tell his story, his desire to redefine himself outside the constraints of monarchy. These are legitimate themes, and they deserve serious consideration. But what the Lorraine Show revealed was that the longer a narrative is repeated without challenge, the more brittle it becomes when finally tested. From the first exchange, the tone signaled that this would not be a performance of comfort. Lorraine Kelly's opening was conventional, even warm, the kind of introduction morning television relies on to establish rapport. But Prince Harry's response was clipped, guarded, almost preemptively defensive. This matters, because defensiveness at the outset often suggests an expectation of confrontation, not dialogue. It suggests that the guest has arrived prepared not to engage, but to protect. And that posture framed everything that followed. When the conversation turned to the reason for his return to the UK, the answer itself was straightforward. A charity event. A professional obligation. Nothing inherently controversial. What changed the atmosphere was not the content of the answer, but the contempt embedded within it. The implication that public curiosity was intrusive rather than predictable revealed a recurring tension in Prince Harry's public engagements, the desire to command attention while resenting scrutiny. This is not unique to him, but it is magnified by his position. Public figures who build platforms on visibility cannot easily argue that interest itself is illegitimate. Lorraine's follow-up question, noting the perceived contradiction between his public rejection of Britain and his physical return to it, was not hostile. It was logical. Viewers were likely asking the same thing. This is where the interview first crossed from promotional territory into analytical territory, and it is precisely where the discomfort began. Prince Harry's response reframed scrutiny as obsession, positioning himself not as a participant in public discourse, but as a victim of it. The problem with this framing is that it collapses accountability into persecution. It suggests that any question, regardless of tone or intent, is an act of aggression. As the discussion shifted to comparisons between life in Britain and life in America, the narrative hardened. Prince Harry spoke of freedom, control, and relief, contrasting them sharply with his experiences in the UK. These are subjective experiences, and there is no reason to doubt that they reflect genuine feelings. But when subjective experience is presented as objective judgment, it invites response. Lorraine's clarification was not accusatory, it was interpretive. Was he implying that his life in Britain held no value? That nothing here mattered? The question was not designed to trap him, but to understand the scope of his claim. His answer, however, was absolute. He did not soften it. He did not contextualize it. He rejected nuance entirely. This is a critical moment, because absolutism leaves no room for shared understanding. When someone declares that an entire country, culture, or chapter of life was purely destructive, they are not simply describing pain. They are dismissing complexity. And complexity is where credibility lives. Lorraine's role in that moment shifted subtly but significantly. She stopped acting as a facilitator and began acting as a representative of the audience. Her questions became less about his feelings and more about their impact. This is an important distinction. Journalism does not exist to validate emotion alone, it exists to examine how personal narratives intersect with public meaning. When Prince Harry dismissed potential disappointment or hurt as irrelevant, he positioned himself above the very audience he was addressing. That stance may feel empowering to the speaker, but it often alienates listeners. The tension in the studio was not theatrical. It was structural. It came from the collision between a man who no longer wished to be interpreted and a host whose job required interpretation. Lorraine did not raise her voice. She did not insult him. She simply refused to surrender her role as an interlocutor. And that refusal exposed something critical. Prince Harry's comfort appears to depend not on being understood, but on being unchallenged. When the conversation turned toward rumors about his marriage, the reaction was immediate and intense. It is worth pausing here, because this moment has been widely debated. Was the question appropriate? Was it invasive? Or was it inevitable given the media environment Prince Harry continues to operate within? Lorraine framed the question carefully, acknowledging speculation without endorsing it. She offered him an opportunity to respond directly, rather than through intermediaries. In traditional media terms, this is often considered a courtesy. Prince Harry's response, however, framed the question itself as a betrayal. He expressed shock that Lorraine would raise it, positioning her alongside tabloid forces he has long condemned. The issue here is not whether the rumor was true or false, but whether engaging with it constitutes harm. Prince Harry has repeatedly argued that speculation damages his family, yet he continues to participate in platforms where speculation thrives. This is another contradiction that the interview quietly illuminated. Lorraine's observation that his defensiveness suggested sensitivity was not a diagnosis, it was an interpretation. It reflected what many viewers were likely sensing. His reaction escalated quickly, moving from rebuttal to accusation. In that escalation, something revealing occurred. The conversation ceased to be about facts or clarification and became about control. Prince Harry objected not to misinformation, but to the loss of authority over the narrative. This pattern repeated when the discussion turned to his memoir. Spare was a deeply personal project, one that invited readers into his inner life with unprecedented openness. Criticism of its reception, therefore, was always going to feel personal. But Lorraine's question about its long-term impact was measured. She did not call it a failure. She asked whether public interest had shifted. His response reframed criticism as intellectual inadequacy on the part of readers. This was perhaps the most striking moment of the interview so far, because it inverted the relationship between storyteller and audience. To suggest that readers did not understand the work because they were not intelligent enough is to undermine the very act of communication. If a message consistently fails to land as intended, the issue may not lie solely with the audience. This is not a condemnation of the book, but a reflection on how meaning is co-created. Lorraine's challenge here was subtle but profound. She asked him to consider how his words sound, not how they feel to say. At this point, the interview had moved far beyond its original scope. It was no longer about charity appearances or promotional cycles. It had become an examination of how Prince Harry positions himself in relation to the public. Lorraine's question about the monarchy crystallized this tension. She pointed out that while he rejects the institution, much of his platform is built upon it. This is not hypocrisy in itself, it is a reality of inherited visibility. But acknowledging that reality requires a willingness to sit with contradiction. Prince Harry's rejection of that premise was categorical. He insisted that the monarchy was irrelevant to him, that he had moved on entirely. Yet the setting, the conversation, and the subject matter all contradicted that claim. Lorraine did not accuse him of exploitation. She simply stated the observable facts. He was in Britain. He was discussing the monarchy. He was doing so on a platform that existed because of public interest in his royal identity. These facts do not negate his pain, but they complicate his claims of detachment. The moment Lorraine suggested that his posture resembled bitterness rather than freedom marked a turning point. This was no longer an abstract critique. It was a direct interpretation of his demeanor. Importantly, she framed it as perception, not diagnosis. She referenced what many believe, not what she personally asserted. This distinction matters, because it placed the responsibility back onto him. How does he want to be seen, and how do his words contribute to that image? His reaction was explosive. The mention of his brother and sister-in-law triggered an immediate emotional response. This suggests that despite claims of indifference, these relationships remain deeply charged. Lorraine's refusal to retreat in that moment demonstrated journalistic resolve. She did not escalate. She did not personalize. She reiterated that she was articulating public perception. In doing so, she underscored a central theme of the interview: once a story enters the public sphere, it no longer belongs solely to its author. When Prince Harry accused the interview of becoming a joke, it signaled a collapse of dialogue. Insults often appear when a speaker feels cornered, not by hostility, but by inconsistency. Lorraine's decision to suggest ending the interview was not punitive. It was pragmatic. Conversations require mutual respect, and respect had eroded. His removal of the microphone and abrupt exit transformed the interview from tense to historic. Walkouts are symbolic acts. They communicate refusal, not just disagreement. Lorraine's response afterward was restrained. She did not editorialize. She did not gloat. She acknowledged unpredictability and reaffirmed her role. This restraint contrasted sharply with the emotional intensity that preceded it, and that contrast amplified the moment's significance. Viewers were left not with a clear verdict, but with unresolved questions. That unresolved quality is precisely why the interview lingered in public consciousness. And yet, the story did not end there. When Prince Harry returned to the set after the break, the atmosphere had changed. The earlier tension had hardened into something more brittle. His posture was closed. His tone was confrontational from the outset. Lorraine, by contrast, appeared steadier, almost calmer. This reversal is telling. Often, the person who believes most strongly in their position feels less need to assert it aggressively. Their resumed discussion returned to the issue of identity and relevance. Lorraine voiced a question that many avoid asking directly: without the royal connection, would the public still care? This is not an insult, it is an inquiry into the nature of celebrity. Prince Harry's offense at the question revealed how deeply intertwined his sense of self remains with that connection, despite his efforts to disavow it. His reference to military service and advocacy work was valid, but it did not fully address the question. The question was not about worth, it was about attention. When Lorraine pointed out that he himself had leaned into the label spare, she highlighted another contradiction. Reclaiming a narrative does not erase its power. Sometimes it reinforces it. Prince Harry's insistence that others still don't get it suggests an expectation that meaning should be received exactly as intended. But communication rarely works that way, especially in the public sphere. As the exchange intensified, Lorraine articulated the core issue with clarity: the inability to let go. Prince Harry framed continued engagement as necessary for healing. Lorraine suggested it might be perpetuating harm. This is not a moral judgment, it is a psychological observation that many viewers likely recognized. The question of cost became central. At what point does truth-telling become self-consuming? At what point does narrative maintenance eclipse growth? Prince Harry's reference to perceived abandonment during moments of crisis added emotional gravity. Pain does not disappear because it is questioned. But pain does not absolve contradiction either. Lorraine acknowledged his suffering without conceding her critique. This balance is difficult to maintain, and it is where many interviews fail. This one did not fail because it was uncomfortable. It succeeded because it allowed discomfort to exist without resolution. When Lorraine suggested that monetization complicates truth, she touched a nerve. The relationship between storytelling and profit is unavoidable in modern media. Prince Harry's reaction suggested that he viewed this observation as an accusation. But it can also be understood as an invitation to reflect. If truth is intertwined with contracts and platforms, how does one preserve credibility? This is not a question with an easy answer, but it is one worth asking. His accusation that Lorraine was no different from tabloids collapsed important distinctions. Tabloids assert. Interviews inquire. The refusal to recognize that difference suggests a worldview in which all scrutiny is hostile. This worldview may feel protective, but it is ultimately isolating. Lorraine's response, drawing a line between questioning and victimhood, was perhaps the most incisive moment of the entire exchange. And when she finally articulated that he appeared to be dismantling himself rather than the institution he opposed, something shifted. For the first time, Prince Harry did not immediately respond. Silence filled the space where certainty had lived moments before. That silence spoke volumes. It suggested that beneath the rhetoric, beneath the anger, there may be an unresolved reckoning still waiting to happen. This is where part one of this story must pause, not because the conflict ended, but because it deepened. What followed would push the conversation from confrontation into something closer to exposure, raising questions not just about Prince Harry, but about how we all engage with narratives of pain, power, and public life. And to understand that, we need to examine what happened next, and why it mattered far beyond a single morning broadcast. What followed after that moment of silence was not merely the continuation of an interview, but the unmasking of a deeper dilemma that extends far beyond Prince Harry or Lorraine Kelly. It became a meditation, unfolding in real time, on what happens when a public figure builds an identity around resistance but cannot escape the gravity of the system he resists. The air in the studio after that pause felt altered, as if the conversation had crossed an invisible threshold. This was no longer about defending positions. It was about exposure, not of secrets, but of patterns. Prince Harry's eventual decision to stand up again and leave the set did not read as strategic. It read as instinctive. The physical act of removing the microphone, repeated now for the second time, carried symbolic weight. A microphone is not merely equipment. It is an agreement. It signifies participation, consent, and engagement. To remove it is to withdraw not just from the conversation, but from the shared space of accountability. And yet, paradoxically, the act itself became the loudest statement of the day. Lorraine's response in that moment was notable for what it lacked. There was no visible triumph, no cutting remark, no attempt to reclaim dominance. Instead, there was stillness. She remained seated. She did not chase him with words. This restraint mattered, because it allowed the moment to speak for itself. In media, excess commentary often dilutes impact. Here, silence amplified it. Viewers were left to interpret what they had seen without guidance, and that interpretive space is where meaningful reflection happens. The aftermath of the walkout unfolded almost instantly beyond the studio walls. Clips circulated online stripped of context. Looped endlessly, framed by competing narratives. Some portrayed Prince Harry as courageous, refusing to submit to what they saw as hostile questioning. Others framed him as thin-skinned, unwilling to tolerate even moderate scrutiny. What is important here is not which interpretation is correct, but why both could coexist so easily. That duality speaks to the unresolved contradictions at the heart of his public persona. Prince Harry has consistently argued that he wants to be seen as an individual, not as a symbol. Yet symbols behave differently from individuals. They invite projection. They accumulate meaning beyond intention. When he speaks, he is not only expressing himself, he is interacting with an image shaped by history, media, and public expectation. The interview exposed the tension between wanting to control that image and resisting the mechanisms that shape it. Control without engagement is impossible. One cannot opt out of interpretation while remaining highly visible. Lorraine Kelly's role in this dynamic deserves careful examination. She did not approach the interview as an adversary. She approached it as a moderator between Prince Harry and the audience. Her questions, while pointed, were grounded in observable realities, public statements, published work, ongoing media presence. She did not introduce new allegations. She did not speculate wildly. She asked him to reconcile his claims with his actions. This is not antagonism. It is analysis. The discomfort arose because analysis challenges coherence. When narratives are internally consistent, they withstand questioning. When they rely on selective framing, questioning feels like attack. Prince Harry's repeated insistence that he was misunderstood, that others didn't get it, suggests a belief that his story exists in a closed system. But public stories are not closed systems. They are collaborative, shaped by reception as much as intention. One of the most revealing aspects of the interview was how often Prince Harry framed disagreement as moral failure. Critics were not merely wrong, they were ignorant, malicious, or cruel. Questions were not neutral, they were betrayals. This binary framing simplifies emotional reality, but it also narrows the space for dialogue. When only affirmation is acceptable, conversation collapses into monologue. And monologues, no matter how passionate, do not persuade. It is worth noting that Lorraine did not deny his pain. At multiple points, she acknowledged the suffering he described. What she questioned was the way that suffering was being deployed. Pain can explain behavior, but it does not excuse all of it. This distinction is crucial, and it is one that public discourse often struggles to maintain. The interview succeeded precisely because it refused to collapse empathy into endorsement. As the segment concluded and Lorraine addressed viewers directly, her words were carefully chosen. She did not declare a winner. She did not frame the exchange as entertainment. She framed it as a moment of accountability. That framing is significant, because it repositioned the spectacle away from personality conflict and towards civic responsibility. Live television, she reminded viewers, is unpredictable. But unpredictability does not absolve participants from the consequences of their choices. The broader reaction to the interview revealed something equally important about audience expectations. Many viewers expressed discomfort not with the questions, but with the tone of Prince Harry's responses. The frustration was not that he disagreed, but that he dismissed. There is a difference between asserting boundaries and expressing contempt. The former invites respect, the latter erodes it. This distinction became increasingly apparent as commentary unfolded in the days that followed. What makes this moment particularly instructive is that it did not rely on scandal or revelation. There were no leaked documents, no shocking confessions. Everything that occurred was visible, audible, and contextual. And yet, it felt revelatory. That suggests the revelation was not about information, but about alignment. The interview revealed a misalignment between Prince Harry's stated values and his communicative behavior. He has spoken often about compassion, understanding, and mental health. These are vital conversations, and his willingness to engage them publicly has undoubtedly helped many. But compassion, when invoked selectively, loses credibility. Understanding, when demanded but not extended, becomes performative. The interview placed these values under pressure, not to negate them, but to test their application. Lorraine's observation that he appeared trapped by his own anger resonated because it echoed a broader cultural concern. In an era where personal narrative is currency, where identity is often constructed through opposition, there is a risk of becoming defined by what one resists. Prince Harry's story has, for years, been framed around escape. Escape from duty, from scrutiny, from tradition. But escape without integration often leads not to freedom, but to repetition. This is not unique to him. Many public figures struggle with the same dynamic. What made this interview stand out was its clarity. It stripped away layers of mediation and revealed the raw mechanics of narrative defense. Each time Prince Harry was invited to reflect, he redirected blame. Each time he was asked to contextualize, he retreated into absolutes. This pattern is not evidence of malice. It is evidence of unresolved conflict. The idea that he is still negotiating his relationship with the monarchy, despite claims of indifference, is not an accusation. It is an observation supported by behavior. Continued engagement, continued commentary, continued emotional investment all suggest that the story is not finished. And that is not inherently negative. Stories rarely end cleanly. But denying their continuation only prolongs their hold. One of the most poignant moments came when Lorraine suggested that titles do not define character. This was not an attack on Prince Harry's identity. It was an invitation to reframe it. To consider who he might be beyond opposition, beyond grievance, beyond reaction. The fact that this suggestion provoked anger rather than reflection speaks to how tightly his current self-concept is bound to struggle. The audience reaction in the studio mirrored the reaction at home. There was no applause when he left the second time. There was no cheering. There was silence. Silence can signify many things: shock, discomfort, contemplation. In this case, it likely signified all three. Silence is often what follows when certainty dissolves and questions take its place. In the days that followed, defenses hardened on all sides. Supporters argued that Prince Harry was unfairly provoked, that his boundaries were violated, that trauma explains his reactions. Critics argued that he displayed entitlement, arrogance, and an inability to tolerate dissent. Both sides, in their certainty, missed something essential. The interview was not about proving him right or wrong. It was about revealing the cost of unresolved contradiction. Media framing played a significant role in shaping these reactions. Headlines emphasized conflict. Clips isolated moments of anger. Commentary rewarded polarization. This is the ecosystem Prince Harry has repeatedly criticized, and yet it is the ecosystem he continues to engage. The interview demonstrated that one cannot dismantle a system while relying on its mechanics. Change requires not just critique, but transformation of approach. Lorraine Kelly did not emerge from the interview unscathed. Some accused her of pushing too far, of prioritizing confrontation over care. These critiques deserve consideration. Journalistic responsibility includes sensitivity. But it also includes persistence. The line between the two is not fixed, it shifts depending on context. In this case, the context was a public figure with immense influence, addressing issues of public interest. Avoiding difficult questions in that context would not have been kindness. It would have been abdication. The most enduring impact of the interview lies not in its viral moments, but in the questions it leaves behind. What does accountability look like for someone who defines themselves as a victim of systems? How does one maintain empathy without surrendering critical thinking? When does storytelling become self-entrenchment rather than self-expression? Prince Harry's story is far from over. Neither is the public's relationship with it. But this interview marked a shift. It suggested that the appetite for unchallenged narrative may be waning, replaced by a desire for coherence, reflection, and growth. Audiences are not asking for perfection. They are asking for consistency. The Lorraine Show, unexpectedly, became a stage for this cultural reckoning. Not because it sought to be, but because it allowed tension to surface rather than smoothing it away. In doing so, it reminded viewers that meaningful conversations are rarely comfortable, and that discomfort, when handled with restraint and respect, can be productive. As viewers, we are left not with answers, but with responsibilities. To listen critically. To empathize without excusing. To question narratives without dehumanizing those who tell them. Prince Harry's interview was not a failure of civility. It was a mirror held up to the complexities of modern public life. Perhaps the most important question to ask is not whether Lorraine went too far, or whether Prince Harry was treated unfairly. Perhaps the question is what this moment reveals about our collective tolerance for contradiction. About our willingness to engage with complexity rather than retreat into allegiance. Because in the end, this was not just about a prince and a presenter. It was about how stories are told, who controls them. And what happens when control slips. And as the studio lights dimmed and the broadcast ended, what lingered was not anger, but uncertainty. An uncertainty that invites reflection rather than resolution. And that, perhaps, is where the real conversation begins.